All right, so we wanted to wrap up this morning with a brief discussion about some considerations to keep in mind when you're developing both watershed-based plans and proposals that include the development of a watershed-based plan. So, since we have made such a strong emphasis this morning on the development of watershed-based plans in this cycle 604B RFP, we wanted to provide some guidance on what we'll be looking for when we're reviewing draft watershed-based plans and proposals that have a watershed plan development element in them. A number of the attendees here today, I think, have already prepared watershed-based plans and submitted them to us for approval. But for folks that have not had that opportunity, a watershed plan is a comprehensive strategy that guides a community through the steps to restore, protect, and improve the health and ecological function of a watershed. A watershed plan should address all the resource concerns of the community and should be as holistic as the community needs it to be in order to attain its resource concerns. I think we've had a few slides already this morning regarding what the EPA minimum 9 elements are, so I won't read these to you, but the slide will be available and you can read these on your own. So when we first started reviewing watershed plans, the projects were typically fairly tightly targeted, and they may have been addressing just one or two resource concerns and in a specific area. And the purpose was to make the project eligible for 319 funding. But we feel at this point in time that we would like to see watershed plans sort of expand and be more robust and more comprehensive and kind of shift away from those more tightly targeted watershed plans that we had been accepting in the past. So when you're preparing your watershed plan, we want you to think in terms of a person who doesn't know anything about your watershed. You want to provide adequate background information to describe not only the purpose and the goals of the plan, any challenges that you're trying to address, any previous actions that have been conducted, but also provide a general characterization of the watershed and include any elements that may inform or impact management actions. We also want to make sure that when you are evaluating data that exists in the watershed, that you also consider any data gaps that might exist. When you identify it, oh, thank you. When you identify a data gap, that can become an implementation that you recommend further on in the plan as well. We want to make sure, I think Megan mentioned this a little bit, that you include a broad array of structural and non-structural practices. And the idea is that we want plan preparers to identify a variety of management practices that anyone, any stakeholders in the watershed can implement. So varying levels of complexity, varying levels of cost, so that any organization, regardless of what their ability is, will find something in the plan that they can implement. One thing that's very important is to make sure that all the information in the elements align. So if you talk about a management measure in element C, make sure that you include that in the subsequent sections. And finally, when you are describing how the plan will be evaluated, in other words, are the management measures resulting in a positive impact? Make sure you include who will or who is most likely to implement the plan. Describe how the plan will be evaluated, what's the process that you plan to use. And importantly, describe what steps you'll take if there isn't any progress observed, because that's really important. Watershed plans are intended to be iterative. They're intended to be constantly evaluated and updated. So make sure that in that last section, I know you've been writing this plan, you're just ready for it to be done, but make sure that you explore these elements and provide this information. All right, so some things to keep in mind when you're preparing your proposal. Do you have a good understanding of what the problem is, or do you need to do additional watershed assessment? So make sure that you include funding in that proposal task to conduct any additional assessment that might be needed. Again, do you have adequate water quality data, or do you need to collect more data? Make sure that you provide enough funding to do additional data collection. And especially sometimes when you start doing your watershed assessment, you may discover that there's something that you didn't anticipate when you were preparing your proposal. So you want to make sure you've got a little bit of a cushion there. Do you need to budget for site assessment work? Do you need to do any kind of soil testing or shoot elevations to determine, what your grades are and if your project is going to drain properly? Do you plan on developing conceptual plans, or do you want to go ahead and develop some plans that are at better than conceptual? So make sure you provide enough funding there. The worst thing is to get into your project and then discover you don't have enough funding to do the work that you want to do, and then have to start shuffling funds around within your grant. And then finally, once you have prepared your watershed-based plan, make sure that you have enough funding to cover the cost of any revisions. So you submit the plan to DEP, we review it, we send it back to you with our recommendations. Just make sure you have enough funding so that you're able to cover the cost of any revisions that are necessary. All right. I included a couple of resources here. I won't go through those. We're going to share the slides, so you'll have access to all of these resources. And I do, oops, sorry, my screen is being crazy. We are planning on holding a watershed-based plan development workshop sometime later this fall, so we will really dive into all these subjects in much, much more detail. So watch for that to come out sometime later this year. And that is it for my very, very quick presentation. And I will entertain any questions that you might have.